In this video of Game of Theories, I'll first introduce moral development theory, its criticism, and influence of power on leaders' moral reasoning. Lawrence Kohlberg's theory of moral development is one of the most influential theories on moral reasoning during the second half of the 20th century. The theory explains how we make moral judgment of what is morally right or wrong from the perspective of moral reasoning. The moral development theory states that our ability to reason about moral issues develops from childhood onward, following a well-defined hierarchy that spans across 6 stages, and the 6 stages are sequential and irreversible. At stage 1, moral reasoning is guided by punishment and obedience. Right is defined by rewards. Wrong is defined by punishment. Sharing toys with others is right because we are praised for doing so. Stealing toys is wrong because we are punished for doing so. We obey rules and do things to avoid punishment. At stage 2, moral reasoning are instrumental, relativist-oriented. Fairness and equal sharing are always interpreted in terms of how they will impact us. We begin to understand favors and returning favors, such as the principle, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. But we return favors only if it serves our interest. Together, stages 1 and 2 are pre-conventional. Our moral reasoning is motivated by self-interest and are therefore considered the least sophisticated reasoning. People's moral reasoning stay in stages 1 and 2 before they are 9 years old. At stage 3, our moral reasoning is based on social approval. This stage is also referred to as good boy, good girl orientation. Right and wrong are defined by the majority. Right is whatever pleases others. Wrong is whatever is disapproved or disliked by others. We conform to the group to gain social approval and trust from others. At stage 4, our moral reasoning incorporates the broader social, legal, and religious system of norms that are present within our society. Right is defined by our duty to society. We show a respect for authority. We obey laws without questioning them. Stages 3 and 4 are conventional. Unlike the pre-conventional stages 1 and 2, in which moral reasoning is mostly driven by self-interest, when we reach stages 3 and 4, our moral reasoning is less self-centered and more other-centered. Moral reasoning for most adolescents and adults are at stages 3 and 4. Kohlberg believed that most adults do not progress past this stage. James Weber's study on managers' moral reasoning reported that managers' moral reasoning was typically at stages 3 and 4, which was similar to most adults in Western urban societies and other business managers. Not everyone progresses to the highest stage of moral development of stages 5 and 6. Only a small percentage of people ever progress past this stage. Around 10 to 15 of all people reaches the next stage of moral reasoning. At stage 5, moral reasoning emphasizes individual rights and the collective well-being. We conform to maintain communities. Our moral reasoning takes into consideration the different values, opinions, beliefs of other people. Unlike the previous stage in which we obey laws without questioning them, at stage 5, we believe rules of laws are important for maintaining a society, but members of the society should agree upon those rules, laws, and standards. When laws infringe on our own sense of justice, we can choose to ignore them. As I said earlier, Kohlberg didn't believe every adult's moral reasoning reaches this stage. Finally, at stage 6, moral reasoning combines the rules of the society with universal principles of justice and care for the collective well-being. We perform abstract reasoning. We follow our own internalized principles of justice, even if they conflict with rules and laws. Together, stages 5 and 6 are post-conventional. Moral reasoning is the most sophisticated because we move beyond our own self-interest and our desire for social approval. We focus on the public good, the collective well-being, when deciding what is the morally appropriate action. Again, Kohlberg believed that only a small percentage of people ever reach this most sophisticated stage of moral reasoning. If your moral reasoning reaches stages 5 and 6, congratulations, you are one of a few. Like all theories, the theory of moral development is not perfect. If you want to advance this theory, how would you start? One criticism was about the sequential and irreversible stages of moral reasoning. Kohlberg argued that moral reasoning develops one stage at a time in an upward, progressive manner and without skipping a stage or regressing to a previously acquired stage. Is that correct? Some studies found signs of regression. In organizational context, the size of organizations influences administrators' moral reasoning. James Weber presented 3 moral dilemmas to administrators and reported that the administrators tended to reason at lower moral reasoning stages as their organizational size grew bigger. In a later study, James Weber added that administrators' moral reasoning was influenced by many other forces in organizations, such as the type of harm, for example, psychological harm, economic harm, and physical harm. Specifically, administrators tended to reason at lower moral reasoning stages as the types of harm changed from physical harm to economic harm to psychological harm. Moreover, administrators' moral reasoning was influenced by the magnitude of the consequences. For example, there are different magnitude of the consequences when it comes to life and death issue, an injury issue, and the job termination issue. Administrators tended to reason at lower moral reasoning stages as the consequences decline. One implication of the findings is that if we frame moral issues differently by types of harm and magnitude of consequences, we may be able to evoke different stages of moral reasoning. The empirical evidence provided by Weber and many other scholars suggested that moral development may not progress in sequential and irreversible stages, as Kohlberg proposed. Moral development may therefore not represent a fixed cognitive construct, but it might instead be relatively flexible and potentially influenced by contextual factors that reside outside the content of the moral dilemma. An administrator may reason at sophisticated stages 5 and 6 in some context, but reason at less sophisticated stages 3 and 4 in other contexts. In my earlier videos on power, sources of power, and implicit power motive, I mentioned that power is essential in leadership as leaders influence followers to achieve a shared goal. Here is the question. Does power influence how leaders make moral and ethical decisions? How can we advance the moral development theory in the field of leadership research? In this video, I introduce one article that builds on the theory of moral development and explores the influence of power on moral reasoning and self-interested behavior. The paper is titled, Does Power Corrupt the Mind? The Influence of Power on Moral Reasoning and Self-Interested Behavior. It was published in the journal The Leadership Quarterly in 2021. In the article, power was defined as the amount of discretion and means that one has to influence others in line with one's own will. Based on this definition, we can evaluate how much power an individual has by two components. First, the amount of discretion. If I have more discretion than you do, it implies I may be able to enforce my will over you. Second, influence on others. The more power I have, the more people will be influenced by my decisions and behaviors. So the people who have more power are the ones who have more discretionary choices and more subordinates and followers. We also have empirical evidence suggesting that power enables people to engage in self-interested behavior. For example, power increased people's tendency to use information to their personal advantage and to make more self-serving resource allocations. Those self-serving resource allocations are at the expense of the interests of others. Moreover, high power increases the use of rule-based moral reasoning, also called deontological moral reasoning, whereas low power increases reliance on outcome-based moral reasoning, also known as consequentialist moral reasoning. This means the more power I have, the more focus I place on rules, procedures, principles, protocols, and policies. I make decisions by the book and stick to the rules, regardless of the fact that those rules and procedures don't make sense and are even harmful to organizations and are counterproductive to the shared goal. On the other hand, low-power people tend to decide what is right or wrong by consequences. The less power I have, the more likely I make exceptions in my decision-making. With all the evidence suggesting the influence of power on moral reasoning, is it possible that having high power reduces the sophistication in moral reasoning? Is it possible that power holders' moral reasoning tends to regress instead of progress to lower stages of moral reasoning and place more focus on self-interest and less focus on others' interest? To answer this question, the authors of the article, Does Power Corrupt the Mind?, designed experiments to collect data on power, moral reasoning, and self-interested behavior. The results of data analysis suggested that having power over more followers decreased leaders' moral reasoning, and having higher power to enforce one's will enabled leaders to engage in self-interested behavior. People's moral reasoning is not a stable cognitive process. Rather, it is influenced by how much power we have and ultimately influences our self-serving behavior. Once we have power, we tend to lose self-control, we focus more on self-interest, and we become our own worst enemy. Let's look at some statements made by former Atlanta Public School Superintendent Beverly Hall. She was the APS superintendent from 1999 to 2010 and was named Superintendent of the Year in 2009. Beverly Hall was the superintendent when APS was involved in the cheating scandal, in which 44 schools were accused of cheating on state-administered standardized testing in 2009. Here is the report from Atlanta Journal-Constitution. In her interview, May 18, a clear picture of Hall emerged as a detached and isolated leader who listened only to the few in her inner cycle. Top administrators told investigators they felt the need to protect Hall from too much information to allow her deniability. Hall said she was unaware they did that. There was obviously something for greater concern here, but my job was not to go into every classroom and to every teacher, but to have someone look at that and tell me what that meant from their vantage point. People who have known me and worked for me have never described me as a tyrant, or they've never said they are afraid of me. They are very clear that I hold them accountable for their performance. But this is the first in my 40-plus years that I've heard those words associated with Beverly Hall. Hall is known for her hard stance on accountability, but when it comes to her closest staff members, Hall chalked up some questionable decisions to poor judgment. Regional Superintendent Tamara Cotman was reassigned earlier this year for allegedly telling principals during the probe to pen go-to-hell memos to GBI agents. She was also accused of retaliating against an employee who answered questions about the memo. In response to the incident, Hall said that every once in a while, people make bad judgment calls. Well, again, when people are under stress, they do bizarre things, Hall said. Clearly, from my view as a professional, I never would have behaved that way. With what you've learned in this video, how do you apply moral development theory and the influence of power on moral reasoning to explain Beverly Hall's moral reasoning? If you want to know more about how to build a theoretical framework for your research, I have published a book titled Demystify Theories, a workbook for developing theoretical frameworks of educational leadership research. The link of the book is in the description below.